Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that a lot of elk hunters are feeling right now across the West. Elk hunting has changed in 2026. The winter of 25 to 26 has been one of the driest we've seen in many Western states. Snowpack levels are lower than normal in a lot of places, and hunting pressure on public land continues to increase every single year. At least that's the way it can feel. And for many hunters, this combination creates the feeling that elk are becoming harder and harder to find. You scout basins that used to hold elk and they're empty. You hike into country that looked perfect on the map and see nothing. You hear fewer bugles than expected. It's been pretty quiet lately, and it starts to feel like the elk numbers just aren't there anymore. But after more than 3 decades of elk hunting, I can tell you something important. The elk haven't disappeared. They've simply adapted to changing conditions faster than a lot of us hunters have. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent hunter and outdoorsman. In this episode, I'm going to break down what's actually happening on the landscape right now in 2026, how drought, pressure, and changing hunting patterns are all influencing elk behavior, and more importantly, how disciplined elk hunters can still find bulls and have success even in tough years like this. Because the reality is, opportunity is absolutely still out there. You just have to understand where it has adjusted and moved a little bit. If you've been hunting elk for a number of years, you've probably felt it. Something about Western elk hunting today feels a little bit different than it did 10 or 15 years ago. It's not necessarily that elk numbers have collapsed or that opportunities have disappeared. What has changed is the environment elk are living in and the amount of pressure they're dealing with from hunters. Across a lot of the West in recent seasons, winters have been unusually dry, like this year has been crazy dry. Snowpack levels in many mountain ranges have been below historical average or almost non existent, like we have here in Wyoming, which changes how moisture moves through the landscape. When snowpack is limited, like it has been, spring runoff is reduced, and that means less water soaking into high country soils. The result is that many mountains dry out earlier in the summer and early fall than they used to. That early drying also shifts vegetation patterns. Green up often happens earlier, but it doesn't always last that long. Instead of lush forage spread evenly across large areas, green feed becomes more localized around pockets of moisture, like north-facing slopes and shaded timber. Water sources that once felt common can become concentrated and more valuable to wildlife as the season progresses. At the same time, hunting pressure has increased noticeably in many western states, or it feels that way a lot of times. Public land is more popular than ever. Resident over-the-counter opportunities attract large numbers of hunters each fall, and even limited entry units often feel like there are more people on the landscape than it did in the past. Technology has also changed how hunters approach elk hunting. Digital mapping tools, satellite imagery, and e-scouting have allowed hunters to analyze terrain from home months before the season ever opens. While those tools are incredibly useful, we love them, they also mean more hunters are identifying the same obvious basins, benches, and travel corridors before ever setting foot in the mountains. All of those factors combine to create a new reality for Western elk hunting. The elk didn't disappear, they simply adapted faster than most elk hunters did. Dry years reshape how elk move across the landscape. When moisture is limited, the entire system elk depend on, like water, forage, and temperature, all start to compress into smaller pockets of habitat. Elk hunters who understand how that compression works can still find elk consistently, even during drought conditions. One of the first things that happens during dry years is that elk begin concentrating closer to reliable water sources. Springs, seeps, small creeks, and shaded drainage bottoms suddenly become much more important. In wet years, elk can often find moisture in many places across the mountain. In dry years, though, those options shrink and elk begin organizing their daily movement around the areas that still hold water. The same thing happens with forage. During a wet summer, green feed can be spread across wide areas of a basin or a hillside, but when conditions are dry, that green vegetation becomes localized. Pockets of grass, forbs, and browse remain green longer where soil holds moisture, often near water, in shaded pockets, or on cooler slopes. Elk naturally gravitate towards those small islands of nutrition. North-facing slopes and dark timber become even more important during drought. These areas receive less direct sunlight, which allows them to retain moisture longer. The moisture supports green vegetation deeper into the season while also providing cooler bedding cover during warm early season conditions. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations and Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. Another subtle change during dry years is that feed to bed distances often shrink. When good forage and moisture exist in only a few locations, elk don't need to travel as far each day. Instead of covering large areas between feeding and bedding zones, they might spend most of their time inside smaller pockets where food, shade, and security all exist together. This is why water and moisture become so powerful. They're movement anchors during dry years. Elk don't randomly wander the mountains, they organize their daily patterns around the places where the landscape still supports their life. Another major factor shaping modern elk hunting is pressure. If you've spent enough time in the mountains over the last decade, you've probably noticed that more hunters are showing up in places that used to feel quiet. Trailheads fill up faster, more camps appear in the same drainages, and areas that once held elk consistently now feel like they're getting hunted from every direction. Part of that change comes from more resident over-the-counter tags in a lot of Western states. Residents have easier access to over-the-counter opportunities which aren't capped, which means more hunters are legally able to be on the mountain every fall. At the same time, non-resident interest in Western elk hunting has exploded. Elk hunting has become one of the most sought-after big game experiences in North America, and hunters from across the country are traveling west every year to chase that opportunity. Understandably, they're the best animal out there, right? Technology has also changed how hunters move through the landscape. Modern mapping platforms allow hunters to study units, mark access routes, and identify terrain features before ever stepping into the mountains. The same benches, basins, and saddles and travel corridors that once required years of experience to find can now be identified with just a few hours of digital scouting. Elk respond to that pressure in predictable ways, though. They begin bedding earlier in the day. They reduce daylight movement. Mature bulls drift into thick cover, darker terrain where visibility is limited and human access is more difficult. Areas that once produced consistent encounters might suddenly feel empty as elk shift away from the obvious hunting locations. One of the most important principles, though, is to understand this. Pressure compresses elk movement into smaller windows and tighter terrain. So when pressure increases, elk don't disappear. They simply become more disciplined about when and where they move. When elk hunting pressure increases, mature elk don't leave the mountain. What they do instead is shift into terrain that gives them a stronger advantage over hunters. Those areas aren't always far away from where hunters are looking either. I see it every year. In a lot of cases, they're simply less obvious pieces of terrain inside otherwise good country, good elk country, or, guys just aren't approaching those areas from the right way. A lot of times I'll see guys just skirt along the tops of ridges trying to look down and they can't see but maybe an eighth of what's actually in there. So they're not actually hunting it. They don't have the fortitude to hike down in and actually be able to hunt and peek over and look into those drainages from top to bottom, move up, hit the next one. Anyway, One of the most common shifts mature bulls make is into dark north-facing timber. Those slopes receive less sunlight, hold cooler temperatures, and often support thicker vegetation. The reduced visibility in this type of timber gives elk a major security advantage, right? Allowing them to detect movement and scent long before a hunter even gets close. Another place bulls commonly move when pressure increases is onto benches tucked just below ridge lines. Those benches are excellent bedding locations because they allow elk to watch downhill while the wind still carries scent from above. Hunters often just travel along ridge lines or drop straight into basins, unintentionally walking right past those mid-slope bedding shelves. Open avalanche chutes are another overlooked refuge. While open avalanche paths may attract attention from glassing hunters, the edges of those chutes, where thick timber meets scattered openings, often creates ideal feeding and bedding security for elk trying to avoid pressure. Mature bulls will also shift into secondary basins that sit just off the main access routes. Those areas might not be as visually impressive as the large basins everybody studies on a map, but they provide the same ingredients elk need: feed, security, and wind advantage. Finally, mid-slope bedding zones become extremely important under pressure. Like we've talked recently about benches. Check that video out if you need to learn more about benches, because a lot of hunters focus their attention on valley bottoms or high alpine basins, but elk often spend the majority of daylight hours halfway down the mountain where terrain, wind, and cover all work together to protect them. The key lesson here is this: start looking for less obvious terrain inside good terrain. Mature bulls survive by using structure that a lot of hunters just overlook. When conditions become tougher, with dry landscapes, heavier hunter numbers, and more educated elk, the hunters who continue finding success are the ones who adapt their system. Instead of chasing elk where they used to be, they start hunting where elk need to be under current conditions. The first shift is learning to hunt terrain security instead of just elk sign. Tracks, droppings, and rubs all tell you where elk have been, but mature bulls survive by prioritizing terrain that protects them. That means places where wind advantage, visibility, and escape routes all come together. If a piece of terrain doesn't offer security, elk may pass right through it, but they rarely stay there during the daylight. Next, smart hunters begin prioritizing shade, moisture, and escape routes. In dry years, especially, elk gravitate towards cooler slopes or shaded timber and areas where vegetation still holds moisture. Those places allow elk to feed, bed, and regulate temperature without exposing themselves to hunters moving through open country. Another key adjustment is learning to glass smaller hidden pockets rather than just focusing only on the biggest basins on the map. A lot of hunters automatically gravitate towards those large alpine bowls and obvious glassing locations, right? Meanwhile, elk often slip into smaller side pockets or broken terrain or timber edges that are difficult to see from common vantage points. Successful elk hunters also began focusing on transition zones instead of just obvious feeding areas. Instead of waiting on wide open meadows where elk feed at night, they concentrate on terrain elk must travel through as they move between feeding and bedding areas. Those are your transition zones. Ultimately, the modern approach becomes what I call pressure predictive hunting. Rather than simply searching for elk, you start anticipating how elk respond to pressure. When hunters move into obvious country, elk shift into the terrain that offers them security. So when you learn to predict those shifts, you begin finding elk where other hunters never think to look. As pressure increases and conditions become tougher across the West, one thing becomes really clear: modern elk hunting rewards disciplined hunters. The guys who consistently find bulls today are rarely the ones moving the fastest or just covering the most miles. More often, they're the elk hunters who slow down, read the mountain carefully, and make deliberate decisions based on terrain and wind. One of the biggest adjustments a lot of elk hunters need to make is simply slowing down. When elk are pressured, they become quieter and more cautious. Charging aggressively into basins or around ridge tops or pushing quickly through timber often does more harm than good. Slowing down allows you to notice subtle terrain features, fresh sign, and movement patterns that rush hunters are going to walk right past. I just see it every year. A lot of guys just covering point A to point B on a ridge and wonder why they didn't run into any elk, and we're picking the ridge apart from top to bottom, and we're finding elk all the time. Discipline also means learning to read terrain structure instead of hunting randomly. Mature bulls spend most of their daylight hours in places where terrain, wind, and visibility work together to protect them. When you begin identifying benches, mid-slope bedding zones, shaded timber pockets, and travel corridors, elk locations are going to start becoming more predictable for you. Another critical element is learning to trust wind and thermals. Many elk encounters are lost not because hunters chose the wrong location, but because they ignored how air moves through the mountains. Consistently successful elk hunters constantly monitor wind direction, thermal shifts, and how scent travels through very specific terrain features. Discipline also requires avoiding emotional decisions. Elk hunting can trigger urgency, especially when you hear bugles or spot fresh sign, but reacting impulsively often just pushes elk out of an area before the hunt even develops. In a lot of situations, the smartest move is simply positioning yourself correctly and letting elk make the mistake. When terrain, wind, and timing all align, elk are often going to move naturally through predictable routes. The key principle is pretty simple. Consistency now more than ever beats aggression. Hunters who stay patient, disciplined, and controlled are going to continue finding opportunities even in heavily pressured elk country. With all the talk about drought, hunter pressure, and changing elk behavior, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing that elk hunting is simply getting worse every year, right? But that's not really what's happening. The reality is that elk numbers remain strong across most of the western states, and in a lot of regions, populations are still healthy, sustainable, and thriving. What has changed is how elk use the landscape under modern pressure. At the same time, most hunters continue to approach elk hunting in predictable ways. They hike into the same obvious basins, they sit the same water sources, they glass the largest openings and hunt the terrain that looks the best on a map. Mature bulls understand that pressure. They survive by shifting into terrain that offers security, wind advantage, and escape routes. That terrain often isn't far from where hunters are already looking, but it's simply the less obvious pieces of structure inside otherwise good elk country. And because of this, a major opportunity still exists for hunters willing to adapt. When you begin focusing on terrain security, pressure patterns, and moisture-driven habitat like we've talked about, you're often going to start finding elk in places other elk hunters overlook. Ironically, the hunters who adjust to modern conditions often discover something surprising. There is actually less competition where elk truly want to be. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, elk themselves haven't funnily changed all that much. What has changed is the landscape they live in and the pressure they experience every fall. Dry winters, shifting moisture patterns, and increasing elk hunter numbers are simply forcing elk to rely more heavily on the terrain advantage that they've always used to survive. Mature bulls respond by tightening their movement, bedding in more secure locations, and using wind cover and structure more carefully than ever. But none of that makes them unhuntable. What it means is that elk hunting now rewards hunters who are willing to think deeper about the landscape. Those guys who tell me that elk hunting is just luck, good luck. Hunters who learn to read pressure patterns, moisture, terrain structure, and wind behavior will continue finding elk in places that other hunters overlook, and those guys will be successful while the other guys have empty freezers. While some elk hunters walk out of the mountains convinced the elk have disappeared, the disciplined guys, they know that they just need to adapt, and they're going to keep encountering bulls year after year. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use elk country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we've built an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that's built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain. We use real scenarios, hands-on with you. You get one-on-one coaching. You can check that out at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community classroom, my full digital content vault of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. I appreciate all of you. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.